Thank you, Maha. Thank you, organizers, for inviting. I'm not exactly sure what this audience would like to hear, so I'm just going to give kind of an overview of some of the things that we do in the context of like thinking about how to encode behaviors into mechanical structures, or at least what we call mechanical side of artificial intelligence. It has a number of other names that I'll introduce in a minute, but in the context of the types of devices that we build, they tend to be bioinspired, so things like this, but I'll talk about that in a moment. But to sort of frame the way that my group thinks about this is to sort of contrast this with the more classical paradigm of artificial intelligence, which is doing things that would normally require a human level of intelligence in terms of things like controlling behavior, decision making, that sort of thing. This is not what we're doing. This is, I would argue, this is, well, not argue, this is a term that was coined at MIT, over 60, 70 years ago. That is not what we do. Instead, what we do is we think sort of collectively about how we can design and build things, robots typically, that make some of these questions about decision-making easier, simpler, more robust by virtue of their design. So again, a lot of this is takes a lot of bioinspiration into account. There's a number of names for this that people call this in the field. So there's no real, this is just my definition. I don't think there is a decided upon definition, but things like embodied intelligence, morphological computation, whatever. But it all means the same thing to me. How can we think about making control challenges and perception challenges and decision challenges easier by virtue of the hardware? So not thinking about the hardware as an afterthought. I'm going to talk about this sort of theme in the context of a few examples. I'm just going to do this by a sort of illustrative examples, and I'll try to point out where this thesis kind of comes in throughout. So the first topic that I'll mention, this is old now, but is the creation of small flying robots. If I wanted to create the types of robots that might mimic, for example, the species that our previous speaker was talking about, how would I do that? So we spent a lot of time in my lab figuring out solutions to things like microfabrication and actuation and sensing, perception, fluid mechanics, controls, even sort of collaborative behavior. We think a lot about that in my lab. This is an example of sort of an archaic way to build these things. I won't get too deep into this, but I'll just say that we have come up with better ways of doing this, which is now also old, but ways that are based upon like origami-inspired mechanisms. So if I wanted to create a sort of a complicated structure with many degrees of freedom, like a flapping wing or multiple flapping wings, how would I do that? And in particular, how would I do that overcoming the challenges of building things at these sort of insect-like scales? And so we do things and I won't get too deep into the details here. I'm happy to talk outside of this. In a multi-layered structure that we create through a combination of surface and bulk micromachining, lamination, we create this quasi-two-dimensional composite. And then the last step is folding this into a three-dimensional object. We then sort of freeze the joints that we want to and release the resulting structure that turns into the device that we want. And so this is an example of this thing kind of in real life. But this is just illustrating, this is just to sort of prove to you that we can build these things, we can build in complexity at small scales in ways that would be difficult or impossible to do with other methods. And so this has led to a lot of really fun explorations, given the fact that we can create insect-like devices at insect scales, and, which is a bit subtle, we don't sacrifice complexity, whatever your definition of complexity is. In the mechanical sense, I'll say like ratio of largest to smallest feature sizes, or like number of degrees of freedom, whatever. We don't sacrifice any of that as we get smaller. In fact, we can do things that in a lot of ways mimic the morphology and the motion behaviors of the animals that they inspire. So we've done this a bunch, and this is from a more recent study where we were looking at like crane flies to inspire things like, and I think this is directly relevant to the thesis. We were looking into crane flies because, as I will show you in a second, after this slide, this is just showing you the sorts of physical complexity that we can pack into a few cubic millimeters. This is like a combination, this is a transmission mechanism that would take actuator motions and map them into flapping motion. And this is like, I don't remember, but 2 spherical 5 bars, 2 spherical 4 bars, and 4 planar 4 bars, all packed within a few cubic millimeters. And so we can create these things. This is just, again, to convince you that we can make these kinds of things. But what you'll notice here is so we can do control on these things. These things are at the time externally tethered for power and control, but one of the sort of maybe examples of this thesis of this sort of encoding behavior or encoding sort of control, if you will, I'm using the term lightly, into these devices is in the wing structure. So that's the sort of first example of not commanding. When I started my graduate work, whatever that was, we were taking inspiration from insect biologist Michael Dickinson at the time, who was describing how insects fly and doing groundbreaking work there and describing the necessary sort of kinematics to achieve the appropriate wing structures, wing motions to generate the flight forces that he was quantifying. And as naive roboticists, we said, okay, well, 2 degrees of freedom, we need 2 actuators per wing, and that turned out to be a terrible idea. The better way to do this is by leveraging a more bioinspired approach, which is flap at the resonant frequency that's defined by the dynamic properties of the components involved. So the inertia of the wing and the stiffness of the actuator, for example. Oscillate that at some efficient frequency, and then allow the rotational motions to be passive, tuned by, again, another set of compliant flexures. So that's one example of, like, as opposed to specifically commanding a trajectory, we encode that trajectory into the design of the structure. Then,
but the insect does also, right? It's like it has some, there's some amount of flexibility of the wing and the connection to the body, right? Is that like what's going on, and it's just kind of tuned to a different material?
That's my understanding of, and that's an example of a bioinspired. For Diptera in particular, that's my understanding of that it's dominated in large part by the passive dynamics of rotation.
Okay.
So fine. With all that in mind, we can do interesting flights and all of that. And this is, getting more and more, better and better sort of models of the system, and we can do things like, adaptive control model, predictive control, and whatever. Okay, that's not maybe super interesting. All of these things are tethered. I'll come back to that. Coming back to the crane fly story is also an interesting, I think, relevance to these discussions is. All of the previous videos that I showed, I don't know if I played them to the end, but when we're done sort of with an experiment, we just crash the robot, which is fine. We get some benefits of scale in terms of surface area to volume ratios and robustness of material. So we don't necessarily destroy the robot as we crash it, as we would with a larger scale drone. But nonetheless, we wanted to be a little bit more gentle because these things they can fail and they're difficult to make and all of that. So instead, we took some inspiration from crane fly legs, and very simple, like adding different dissipative elements within the leg structure to dampen landing. So very, very simple, but it makes landing much easier, because if I didn't have this, what we were seeing is just sort of commanding a trajectory to converge on the ground was insufficient, because as I get close to ground, I get into ground effect, which becomes a bit chaotic, and my moments of inertia are so low, I can't compensate for that. So instead, we can now sort of take off and land.
The control is on board here?
No, not on here. Everything is off board here. So I'll come to that in a second. Yeah, everything is off board. We've also done things with perching. I'll skip that. Well, I guess this is now also old. One of the things that we've done a few years ago is to start to cut the tether. And so that was first, we were doing this with respect to the power systems. And so this looks ugly, but this is a system that contains all the same actuation mechanisms, but now we're implementing some drive electronics on board and powered by a solar array. So we're excited about this. This is not a particularly impressive results to the casual observer, but we were able to prove that we can fly without an external tether. So that was all open loop. So there's no control involved in this, but that was one major step that we had, and this is ongoing work.
Another question that's in insects, I don't know whether this is always true, but there are appendages, soft appendages, which can be used passively to be able to get control, or at least stability, maybe not control. Is it possible to essentially do something like that? Because you have a dynamic movement associated with the oscillations, and so there's a parametric oscillator, and there are modes of parametric oscillators that can be stabilized.
Yeah, so in the context of like hovering flight,
Yep.
I don't believe that's possible for these systems. For forward flight, I think people, and we have a little bit, but like Stacy Combs did some work on like B appendages and abdominal postures to affect moments of inertia with the hypothesis that's a control mechanism.
What you showed with Tom Daniel's group that during hovering the moth abdomen was sufficient to stabilize
The what?
the moth abdomen, flexes and it reorients the flight apparatus in a way to stabilize vertical.
That's cool. Yeah.
And
Yeah, I
that's
think I remember
passive or
that.
active?
That's active control.
That's active.
Yeah, so it's not massive.
But the inertias there are relatively much higher. Yeah.
Huge inertia of the moth abdomen.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, these are all really good questions, and we've tried things like, dangling a
Yeah,
tail,
exactly.
or whatever. And the closest we've got to anything that resembles sort of passive stability and hover is by actually doing it aerodynamically, having surfaces that are like, oops, the surfaces that are kind of above and below the center of mass can do some stability, but again, only in the context of perturbations about a hovering condition. So that's good question. Yeah. And I would love if there are, I think one of the things that my group really likes is like, now that we can build these things, interacting with people like yourselves to say like, hey, have you tried this? Have you tried this? We'd love to try some of these things if you have ideas for this. We also use the same methods. This is not super relevant. This is, again, just more sort of illustrating that we can sort of embed sort of physical complexity in these small scale devices. This is using the same methods that I was describing before, how to make these things and actuate these things. We can make little Lego structures too. Okay, not particularly surprising. Thank you for saying it's cute. It's actually the fastest robot on Earth if you normalize to body length. It's fast, twice as fast as Usain Bolt would be at that scale. But we use the interesting thing for us with these is like, what could these be interesting for in terms of studies? So one of the things we did in concert with Rolls-Royce, the engine manufacturer, not the car, is to leverage the fact that gravity really doesn't matter for these things. Surface area to volume just dictates that surface forces are going to dominate. We can take advantage of that and use this to climb on, in this case, metallic surfaces, but climb on walls and ceilings, and do. Here's another example of that. This is my student trying to be clever and supposed to show you where the gravity vector is. But we can take advantage of that. We can have sort of switchable electrostatic adhesives that can allow these things to wander on ceilings. We can also, another interesting thing is think about like multimodal operation. Again, this is deviating a little bit from this main thesis here, but we can build versions of these that can modulate things like the electrowetting properties. If I sort of have these things skating around on the surface of water, for example, almost like a water strider, and then by just controlling the field applied to these pads on the surface, I can control the contact angle and get them to sink and then walk around and then climb back out. So this is just us kind of playing around with like, okay, we can build these things. What can we do with them, right? That might be interesting. Now this is now over, but more recently we worked with a group that was exploring ultra fast motions in mostly in the animal kingdom, but across a number of species, and trying to again use our methods to try to create prototypes which could explore structure function relationships, but really sort of tease out this notion of power amplification in ultra fast systems. So how can we store energy? There's countless examples. They tend to be at small scales, which is kind of a nice niche for us and the types of things we can make. But how animals that can, for example, or plants or fungi that can store energy very slowly and then release it very quickly. What are the parameters? What are the structures? What are the control inputs that can modulate that behavior? And what sort of dictates the performance? So if I just think about this like as an engineer, I just think about this like a power amplifier. So I can slowly sort of put energy into this and rapidly take it out. Then I've got a pretty dramatic power amplification. So there's examples, and in a few of these examples, this is just a version of that robot that I just showed you, but with, well, I'll come back to that. This is maybe the more interesting one. We took some inspiration. This is work with Sheila Paddock's group at Duke. We took some inspiration from mantis shrimp, which can, I assume you're familiar with these species, but they have these dactyl appendages that can move very rapidly underwater so fast they can create cavitation bubbles, and there's anecdotes that I'm not sure I believe of breaking out of aquariums and that sort of thing. But we studied this mechanism because there are still some open questions about how is energy being stored, where's the musculature, where's the spring in particular, and what is the latch in this sense. So if we think about the typical bow and arrow kind of paradigm, the latch is my fingers, right? That's pretty clear. Okay, and then I slowly stretch and I release, and right. but where's the spring? Where's the latch? How does the latch work? It turns out that we conjectured and kind of showed both mathematically and experimentally that it's a geometric latch, meaning that we kind of have a 4-bar linkage. I don't have a lot of detail on this, but a 4-bar linkage that as we sort of stretch the spring element in the system, which in our case can be anything, but we're stretching a spring element that is storing energy slowly. Once we get past a certain point, kinematically, we pass through the singularity of the 4-bar that instantaneously releases inverts the direction of the torque stored in the spring and allows that rapid motion. So that's what you're seeing here. There's a real time. This is slowed down by I can't remember how much, and then you'll see it in real time. So we can.
The animal stays just under the threshold, and then when he wants to strike it, it goes over the threshold.
That's right. Yeah. I'm not sure I can speak to the biology, but that's the conjecture. Yes. Yeah. And then, so we applied that a similar mechanism along with some inspiration from springtails to get little jumping mechanisms onto these legged robots. And before we did that, there was a fun study that was trying to, similarly for jumping robots, but now studying, there was a group of collaborators in Korea that were studying water strider jumping. So jumping off the surface of water, which is a rather non-intuitive, I guess, at least for more macro scale animals and people, behavior. But it turns out if you design the trajectory of the legs such that you can sort of the total energy, the integral of force and over this sort of whole leg trajectory is insufficient to break surface tension, then you treat the water as a spring. And so that actually turns out you can jump just as well on solid ground as you can on water if you follow that behavior, that constraint. All right, that's a hard stop, or hard turn there in terms of themes. We also started to get interested in this area of soft robotics. So this was maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago. This is not a new area. This is actually a pretty old concept going back to the 80s when there's researchers in Japan that were developing what are now only over the last 10 or so years being sort of dug up and reproduced in terms of creating these sort of elastomeric structures, textile-based structures, and doing some really fascinating initial sort of experiments with what sort of behaviors you can get with these systems. And then there's a whole history. Part of this was accelerated by some DARPA programs in the the 2010 kind of era. We got involved with this. I should say we were talking with Jennifer Lewis here at Harvard and trying to ask a question. This was, I don't know, 6-7 years ago now. No, it was more than that. Maybe it was 10 years ago now. Trying to ask a question like, we can make robots out of rubber or whatever material you want, really, and take advantage of those materials. And I'll come back to why we might want to do that in a minute. But as all of the examples after this I will show you, there's some soft thing, and then there's a whole bunch of rigid things that are more sort of traditional robotic components. So we wanted to ask questions about like how much function could we embed in purely soft materials, and so that led to this project called the Octobot, which was trying to create an entirely soft robot, so no rigid components whatsoever. And so that led to some interesting questions associated with like, well, how are you going to power this thing if you can't use batteries, and how are you going to control distribution of energy if you don't have something more akin to a microcontroller? And so that was the answers to these questions that we had at the time were things like simple decomposition reactions where we can take peroxides and decompose them into pressurized gas, and then we can take the peroxide or the products of that and pass them into, in this case, just simple microfluidic oscillators that can distribute fuel to different catalyst sites and then decompose to power fluidic actuators further downstream. That I won't get into too deep into the details. It's a bit out of scope here, but that led to that in conjunction with some of Jennifer's beautiful. This is a technique they developed called embedded 3D printing, where what you're seeing here is taking this microfluidic chip that does this oscillation, embedding this in a mold with uncured elastomer, and then printing a sacrificial ink into that uncured elastomer so that they could create an artificial vasculature that could guide all of the wherever the fluid goes in the system. That then is then cured, evacuated due to the porosity of the elastomer that we're using, and that led to this device that doesn't do much, but we claimed it was the first soft robot that was entirely soft. It only really does this, but it had some. We were excited because it embodied a number of these elements that we were set out to do. Okay, I'm gonna skip that part. One of the really, I think, sort of strong ties to this overall thesis of trying to embody function within materials is in manipulation. So we, about around 2009 or 10 or whatever, we were starting to think it was like this, as my colleague Oliver Brock says, it was like the alchemy phase of soft robotics. It's like everybody was basically building things. Yeah, look what we can build. We can build a hand. We can build a, an arm. We can do, whatever. And we were part of that too. We were saying, oh, what can we build? We can build digits and hands and starts to sort of tease out what the benefits might be. And they're fairly obvious. If I make a hand if I have a rigid robot hand, a more traditional robot hand, and I want to go grasp something, then I have to be very precise with my motions and with my perception system and my controllers. There's a lot of sort of control guarantees that have to go into that in order to successfully do that. That's fairly obvious. But if I can relax a lot of that just by making it out of some soft elastomer, and I can just kind of, bang into things without fear of hurting them, because I've got this sort of much different mechanical impedance in the structures. But so that's pretty straightforward. But you give up a lot too, and so we've been studying how to get that what you give up back. So one of the things you give up is strength. And so we did some work with Daniela Roos a number of years ago to try to use, this was Shugwang Li who developed this interesting concept for an actuator that's based upon vacuum. So you got this like origami-like structure encased in an envelope that if I suck a vacuum on that, then the motion is guided by the sort of kinematics of that folding structure, and I get in a sort of a value add by the tension in the skin, adding to the overall energy density of this device. This can lead to some interesting reasonably strong grippers and arms, and we can do simple things like lifting car tires. And this is not particularly interesting, but in the context of more traditional robot manipulators, we're still not winning out in terms of the sort of strength that we can have for like payload capacity, for example. But we do win if we think about like strength to weight or payload to weight. We win by quite a bit. So if you think about like a more typical robot arm that's welding doors on cars, it has a much higher payload than this, but it also weighs a couple 100 kilograms. Whereas for, that's this thing, for example, whereas for the things that we're talking about here, it's kind of the opposite. We get a few kilograms of payload, but a few 100 grams of total mass.
For suffering bandwidth.
Yes, we're suffering. So bandwidth is another one, and sort of control precision is another one. I'll kind of get to that a little bit. Yeah, we made all sorts of robot hands out of these things. And we can do things where we can make arms that are sort of selectively stiffening parts. So this was an idea where we wanted to try to get the best of both worlds, where we can get some strength out of these devices, some precision out of these devices by stiffening certain joints when you need precision, and sort of letting them be loose and floppy when you just want to kind of push your way through an obstacle field. And that was sort of fairly, the conclusions for these things are kind of laughably obvious. Is like, okay, some control over distributed stiffness is beneficial for load bearing and for precision. That's not at all surprising. Okay. This is again going back in time to some stuff that we were doing over 10 years ago. This was like this alchemy phase where we were like, okay, we can make these kinds of like elastomeric bladders, and we can start to program motion within these bladders. So I think this is an important example of how we embed behavior within these structures. This is pretty simple in concept. All of these things are just elastomeric bladders, but then we can reinforce these bladders however we want with like inextensible fibers, for example, and the arrangement of those fibers or those inextensible elements will then control motion. So I just have a simple input. I increase pressure on the input, and I can get things like bending, twisting, or bending extension coupling, or extension twisting coupling, or any combination thereof. And I can start to do interesting things. This is a trivial example of this, where I just get extension, bending, coupling, and I get something that kind of sort of looks like a hand. Around that time, we were so this is much more recent now. This is coming back to address the things that we lost in that process. So the things that we lost in that process were, like, again, the strength and the precision in terms of the motion control and the dexterity that we might have. So we had a couple of really talented students that were looking into how can I redesign not just the digits, but the overall the hand design, the digit arrangements, and as well as some other ancillary features to try to get some of that back. And we were using things like in-hand manipulation, so a very dexterous task that we take for granted. We were using that as kind of like the gold standard of the types of behaviors that we want to achieve. And so this is showing a few examples of these, and then I'll kind of fast forward, but exploring things like more degrees of freedom per digit, and these ones, it's more like sort of lateral degrees of freedom versus more serial degrees of freedom. And there's, again, unsurprising consequences of these things. If I have these additional degrees of freedom, then I can do kind of these sort of finger gating motions to do simple in-hand manipulations and reorient things while under a stable grasp. Another interesting aspect of this is that if I do that in the presence of a palm, so if I rest things on a palm, then having surfaces nearby to control, to have another sort of point of contact becomes extremely beneficial, especially for having sort of these in-hand manipulation tasks at arbitrary orientations. The serial degrees of freedom turn out to be really useful when I have very thin objects. So we did another very obvious set of experiments, whereas if I, again, had a more traditional robot hand that I wanted to grasp this piece of paper, then I need to know very precisely where I am with respect to the table surface, maybe something about the object, and be extremely precise with how I approach and try to grasp this thin sheet. With these soft digits, all I need to do is just kind of bang into the table and just sort of grab, open loop, and it works tremendously well. We did some studies that show the sort of range of positional errors that are on the order of many centimeters, and I can still grasp this. And then we can do things that are not necessarily, well, I shouldn't strictly say non-bioinspired, not sort of human hand-like, which is modulating friction on any of these surfaces, and show that can also be a useful tool for simple in-hand manipulation motions. So I'm not going to go through all of these because I'm running out of time here. So I'll just show a couple of highlights. Let me get to this one in particular. This is what I was talking about with respect to manipulation of thin objects. And so we were particularly excited about this. This was part of a NASA project where the overall goal of that project was to develop methods, tools, robots that would help with extraterrestrial habitats, maintenance and setup. And maybe a bit surprisingly, the first line of defense against, like, if I've got a extraterrestrial habitat on the moon, for example, for a micrometeor punctures is duct tape. So how do I develop a robot hand that can apply duct tape? Sounds simple, but is extremely challenging. And so we were able to show that we could do this. This is just a simple like folding exercise. Those are straightforward, but here's the duct tape example. We were able to show that we could do this again by just sort of relying not on precision and manipulation, but relying on the compliance of the digits themselves. And so this was something I would argue is pretty difficult to do with a more traditional manipulator. All right. And I already mentioned palms, but that's a relatively simple thing. This is, again, another non-sort of human-inspired thing that we cannot do, of course. I'm unaware of animals that have additional control surfaces within their graspers, but that's beyond me. So this is just a fairly, again, another fairly obvious observation that if we can have additional degrees of freedom to put things in more stable grasp positions, then that benefits the grasp stability. We developed, so this is maybe just a plug, we developed some simulation tools to help. I haven't mentioned yet about how we make these things. They're pretty quick and easy to make, and they're pretty cheap, but it still takes some time. So we developed some simulation tools that capture the dynamics and the sort of compliance of some of these mechanisms and allow us to do, for example, this was some reinforcement learning experiments in simulation to try to understand not just sort of motion controls, but also design guidelines as well. These are all just based on Pi bullets, so it's pretty straightforward to run these. I'll skip that because I just want to show you how these things are made. This is just some in-hand manipulation. This is another example of an active palm that is not necessarily changing sort of the spatial location, but changing friction. And by changing friction, I can do some relatively simple, again, some in-hand orientation manipulation experiments where just leveraging friction on the palm, I can reorient things now along different axes. All right. And we also study different digit configurations, and this is maybe the least surprising of any of the results I'm talking about, that depending upon how you arrange digits in a hand, I get different capabilities with respect to object geometry. So for example, like a more sort of cross-like structure is good for more spherical or spheroid kind of objects, whereas a more sort of anthropomorphic, sort of opposable thumb kind of thing is really good for more high aspect ratio, baguette-like things. And friction, I'll skip. I already told you about that. We set up, I'll just mention this as a plug, and this is something that one of my former students set up a few years ago, like a lab scale injection molding system for elastomers, which is really enabling for this. Sounds very simple, but it's a really enabling ability for us. We can go from CAD designs to printed molds to elastomer parts to hand in however long it takes to cure the elastomer, basically, and however long it takes to print the mold. So, and we can do that all in house for very low costs. This only costs a couple $1,000s to set up. So I've been kind of evangelizing this and say, like, if you're interested in any of these things, it doesn't take much to set this up. This is work that we were very excited about with Maha a couple years ago, and Kate Becker, who's now at MIT. Now I don't even know the genesis of this, so maybe Maha can fill in some of the blanks. But going way away from any of the sort of anthropomorphic kind of graspers to more sort of stochastic based interactions, and I won't tell you too much about this, but it's just based upon this seemingly simple sort of filamental structure where I have a number, I don't know, maybe a dozen of these sort of high aspect ratio filaments. They are made in such a way that there's some asymmetry within the sort of cross section as I sort of move along the length of these. I do a simple input pressure. I just inflate these things, and they will sort of curl up, almost like a pigtail kind of motion. And so that's fine. If I do that on their own, that's mildly interesting. But if I start to have an array of these things together, then when I start to have objects nearby, they will entangle with either with themselves or with the objects that they're surrounding. This turns out to be super useful for topologically complex objects like branch structures. It turns out to be not so great for ball-like spheroidal kind of structures. A more sort of traditional grasper is probably better for those kinds of things. I'd like to say there's some bioinspiration that is sort of embedded into this, but this is something that is also kind of an open question. Okay, right around this time, how much time do I have? 10 minutes, okay. I'm chronologically out of order here, but actually we started kind of with this. We were making these sort of hands 10, 15 years ago, and that was I showed you a slide of that, and they were just very, very simple structures that were just kind of able to grasp things and not much dexterity, et cetera. I was at a Nat Geo meeting, and one of my now collaborators showed these videos. So this one, and I think I got another one. Of these sampling operations they were trying to do. They were trying to study deep organisms, and things like this glass sponge, right? Which they were, at the time, they were using these tools that were made for the oil and gas industry, so they're way overpowered. They look like the jaws of life, and they're just shredding everything that they would come in contact with. So not only is it, they wanted to do specimen collection and study them. They were interested at the time in studying ocean acidification and how deep coral versus shallow coral might be different in terms of their response to changing ocean conditions. In order to do that, you need the sample, but you also want to get the sample, maybe not for coral, sure, but for other animals, you want to get them sort of minimal stress on the animal. Otherwise, it's going to start to express things that are not representative of its natural state. And that's a total side thing that I'm not qualified to talk about, but they actually proved that out too. If we were doing experiments where we were hugging jellyfish, and if you hug them loosely, they're happy in terms of their gene expression. If you squeeze them, then they're not. So again, not at all surprising. But back to this story. So they had these tools that were horribly inappropriate for the types of delicate operations they were trying to do. We said, hey, we can do better with our soft hands. We pitched an expedition. This was the first expedition, this is me, that are developing these sort of soft fingers here. This is just a very simple structure that I'll show you here. is just doing like a bending, twisting, coupling to form a helical structure. So again, this is sort of encoding this behavior directly within the structure. You can imagine this is at the bottom of the Red Sea. This is only a couple hundred meters deep, but we're pretty limited in terms of what we have. So we've got a pretty crude arm. And you could imagine that, you know, the boat's rocking, and I have, you know, monocular vision. I have, you know, maybe some laser rangefinder. I've got a very finite set of tools to do this, to go and try to grasp this thing, this coral species, with a typical pinch grasp, be hopeless, right? Whereas with this kind of structure, you just get close enough and you wrap around it and you're done. So we kind of started to prove the efficacy of these things. We got on other boats, and this was on now Bob Ballard's boat, much deeper. This is off the coast of California. This is now around 1,800 meters deep. So these types of devices that we're making are totally impervious to the conditions of the deep ocean. They just operate based on pressure, but it's simple pressure differential. So we can have an open seawater engine that just has a few PSI above ambient pressure, and that allows you to control the grasp state for these things. This is a holothuria, which is, I've been told, is the consistency of wet snot. So you can imagine how difficult this would be to sort of grasp. But we can sort of pick them up and put them back. Yes.
To avoid those creatures from escaping from the arm.
Sort of. Maybe if you hold that thought, I'll show you another device in a couple of slides. This was just like, can I do it kind of thing, right? So I don't think we actually in this study, we actually were sampling and actually doing the discovered new species. So they were actually doing sampling. This is the same kind of hand, but now it's on a full arm, and this is a human operated submersible that not the pilot, but the or whatever the submarine operator is called. The person next to him had a glove that was controlling the motion of the arm and hand, and they were grabbing things like this pyrosome or whatever. Right? So the whole point of all of this is just be gentle, some dexterity, but just be gentle in how we're interacting with these extremely delicate, and all over the water column you'll notice too, you know, bottom of the ocean, midwater, whatever, trying to do some sample and some species discovery. We took that concept one step further, and we're working with Mbari. In fact, my students are now off the coast of Brazil. They were supposed to be testing the second generation of this, but the shipment never got there. That's a different story. But this was an example of capturing kind of what you were asking. But this is not at all soft, but the point of this mechanism is to not even touch the animal. So the point of this is, if we want to go and do some discovery, this was kind of a more conceptual push to get away from the more sort of classical means of getting an actual holotype of an organism and bringing it to the surface and killing it, and instead try to study things in situ. So this was an origami-inspired mechanism that's just a dodecahedron that, with a single degree of freedom, will sort of fold itself into a sort of kind of quasi-spheroid kind of shape, dodecahedron shape, and surround a volume that in this case was around this squid. This was not the sort of big picture thing. Idea here is I could capture an animal and study it. I have it, so I can study. I can have chemical sensors in this. I can have videography for morphometry, whatever. I can study this thing in interesting ways. The thing that we were supposed to be testing as we speak was actually a biopsy tool, actually inspired by some of the mantis shrimp work we did. It's a biopsy tool to do a rapid collection of a small tissue sample, so that we would then have genetic analysis. We would have sort of visual studies, morphology, and motion. We could have sort of respirometry, of chemical analysis, and then the animal swims away, mildly annoyed, as you can see. But so this was a kind of a push, kind of like a conceptual push by my colleagues to make a digital holotype, as opposed to having to do things more classically with actual specimens. And the last thing I'll mention very briefly is, I don't know if there's many connections to this group or not, but it's a fun project in the lab, so I'll tell you about it nonetheless. We are part of a big consortium called Project SETI, CETI, which is the Cetacean Translation Initiative, which is trying to decode the communications of sperm whales. And our part of that, we're the robotics arm of that. So we're trying to use some of our past experiences in marine robotics to do data collection. So can we get how much data can we get to feed into a pipeline that involves machine learning and linguists, deciphering what the communications are. And there's all sorts of reasons that we're doing this in terms of like the sperm whales have had the largest brains in the known universe for 50 million or 35 million years. And we know a lot. There's been our biologist lead has been studying these animals off the coast of Dominica in the Caribbean for, I don't know, 20 something years and can recognize the whales in that area are migratory, but they revisit the same locations seasonally. And so there's a whole, we know the lineage of family structures and lineage and who is the mother and the grandmother, and it's all matrilineal. And so we know all of this stuff. They actually have something called Fluke Book, which is just what it sounds like, a Facebook for whales. So we have all of this sort of background understanding of these societies. We can listen to them. They make a lot of noise. They sound the vocalizations they have sound a little bit like Morse code. So it's kind of like clicks, not like humpback whale songs that you might be more familiar with. But anyways, our role in this is try to do data collection. That's what this image is showing. I won't bore you with that. We're developing tools to, for example, cling onto the backs of whales, do multi-channel high fidelity audio recording. This is fun for me as an audio person, that these are way beyond the types of specifications I'd have for a more sort of human focused microphone, partially because we don't know the range of frequencies that are of interest, and so we're just capturing everything. And other things too, like IMUs for posture and pressure sensors for depth and other things too. Another interesting thing is we used to be sort of applying these by a very long pole on a very small boat, which was, I'll just say, difficult and dangerous to say the least, but also extremely inefficient for data collection. We switched recently to drones. This is where we are. We switched recently to drones, and that has turned out to be enabling for a much higher throughput in the data collection process. So what you're seeing here is an overhead view of this process of putting a tag onto the whale, that you can kind of see it there. And so this is just done by, I'll show you here. This is just done by, currently done by first-person video by one of our team members with a VR headset sitting on a boat that's a kilometer or so away. Turns out that I am not allowed to do this, but the younger generation is extremely good at it just because they're literally holding a PlayStation controller. And we target a particular spot, between the blowhole and the dorsal fin and the dorsal ridge, and that turns out to be very. I don't know if I can quote you, the sort of success rates for getting tags on, but it's like 80+%, so it's pretty good. And so that is now also, we're just gearing up to get the human out of that loop. So the idea there is working with Stephanie Gill, who's also at Harvard, to try and automate everything you just saw there, so that I could have sort of listening stations predicting where whales will pop up, and then send sorties of drones with tags to go and do automated tagging, and then go recover the tags afterwards and feed this into the data pipeline that is hopefully leads to.
How do you recover these tiny little tags? Are they just transmitting so you can find them?
Yeah, they'll pop once one of several things happens. They're geofenced, so if they go too far, they'll pop off. If the battery runs out, they'll pop off. If the memory is done, they'll pop off. Whatever the limit, whatever the least amount of those happens first, they pop off, and then yes, they will float upright and lock onto a GPS and say, "Here I am, come get me." And now the collection is manual, but that's not too hard. This is a fun photo there. That's all I think I wanted to say. So happy to talk about any of this stuff.